Torna: The Golden Country is a game of contradictions. It's a DLC expansion to Xenoblade Chronicles 2 that also functions as a standalone title, but its story is broken from either perspective. The game offers massive improvements to the core gameplay, but the way the experience is structured can be incredibly frustrating. Basically, Torna has a lot of flaws, but the things it does well are so outstanding, it doesn't even matter. And even when the devs fail to achieve what they set out to do, they still somehow make the game a better experience for it. First of all, this video's got huge spoilers for Torna: The Golden Country and for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, so just keep that in mind if you haven't already played the games. Torna: The Golden Country obviously plays a lot like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and the basic structure of the game remains very much the same. You control a party of up to 3 drivers, who draw their powers from the symbiotic bonds they form with artificial life forms known as blades. You explore large open-world areas to find treasure, collect resources, and fight monsters. And combat is still all about using driver combos to keep the enemy at bay while building up to a devastating chain attack. But Torna feels a lot like a play-tested version of the base game. A great example is the way it handles aux cores, the accessories you use to customize your blade's abilities. Aux cores in the base game had to be refined through a crafting system before they could be used, but aux cores in Torna come ready to go, so you tend to have a lot more options when you actually need them. Instead, Torna's crafting system is directly tied to the party. Each of the game's 9 playable characters has their own special crafting skill, which allows them to make items of a certain category. Laura makes charms, Jin cooks delicious food, and Mithra takes your stomach on a journey of discovery. Most of the stuff you make are basically pouch items used to give the heroes temporary buffs, but Adam and Hugo's crafting skills create special key items that work a lot like the deeds you could eventually buy from shops in Xenoblade 2. The new crafting system has an incredible synergy with the other parts of the game, where Xenoblade 2's pouch items were all about dropping cash at different shops scattered around the world. In Torna, they're crafted from the collectibles you pick up while exploring, and you can make them wherever you are, which reduces the need for backtracking. You also earn more recipes by completing quests and opening treasure troves, giving you yet another great incentive to explore the world. Torna's world design also feels like a step up from the base game. I had a hard time putting my finger on it, because the changes are subtle, but the environments of Torna just feel better designed than the ones in Xenoblade 2. The physical features of the areas are laid out to give you a stronger sense of freedom as you find your way. The placement of collection points seems a lot more deliberate, and there's enough secrets hiding around every corner of the map to make exploration feel rewarding. The game also introduces some very welcome quality of life improvements to the travel experience. Unique monsters now leave grave markers on the map after you defeat them, helping you keep track of the ones you've already bested. Although you cannot use grave markers to fast travel, like in Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Collection points now show you what type of resource they give, though you'll still have to experiment to see exactly what items. And best of all, collection points are a lot faster to use this time around. It might seem like a tiny nitpick, but it's absolutely not. But Torna didn't fix all the issues I had with Xenoblade 2's exploration. You tend to pick up items in bunches, both from monsters and from collection points, and it can be pretty hard to tell what you actually got. There's still no in-game guidance for where to look for various items and specific monsters, so you either have to Google what you need or wander aimlessly through the world until you find it. And I still think drivers should have gotten the same type of affinity chart that blades have. They're just a lot more fun to play with. Torna's exploration gameplay isn't quite as good as in Xenoblade 3, but it's a big improvement over Xenoblade 2. And even though Torna is a pretty short game with only a couple of areas to offer, each one feels handcrafted with more care and attention than I would have expected for a DLC expansion. Wandering through the Danag Desert at night with a breeze at your back and gazing out past the Titan's enormous wing at a distant world tree cloaked in a shimmer of electric green lights is a truly beautiful moment. The kind that stays with you long after you finish the game. But all of these improvements seem like minor touch-ups when compared to Torna's greatest achievement, the retooling of the core gameplay's most important feature, the combat system. Fighting in Torna is the most fun I've had with combat in the whole Xenoblade series, and it's not even close. And it all comes down to 3 major tweaks the game makes to Xenoblade 2's combat system. The first of these changes is a new mechanic called Vanguard Switch. In Xenoblade 2, you only control the driver directly, while their blades provided support. In Torna, drivers and blades are equal partners that form a dynamic unit called a team, and they take on the roles of vanguard and rearguard as the need arises. In battle, you control the vanguard, while the other member assists from the sidelines, using a separate set of rearguard arts. When you hit the Vanguard Switch button, the rearguard trades places with the vanguard while attacking the enemy with their special switch art. More importantly, Vanguard Switch is also tied to a new recoverable HP mechanic. Damage taken by the vanguard is displayed as a red bar which drains over time, but when you pull off a Vanguard Switch, all of that temporary damage is fully healed. Since Vanguard Switch is on a cooldown, you have to think carefully about when to switch. And since switching characters is often key to keeping your driver combos alive, the synergy between these features is just incredible. The second major improvement to combat is the liberal stance Torna takes towards the use of chain attacks. Don't get me wrong, the chain attack system was already a lot of fun in Xenoblade 2, but in Torna, things get kinda crazy. Blade combos can now go any route, so you never get stuck going down some dead-end combo path you cannot finish. Even better, you now get an elemental orb every time you use a special, instead of just when you complete a blade combo. So building orbs is super fast, which means getting a full burst is super easy. In 135 hours across 2 separate playthroughs of Xenoblade 2, I've never once gotten a full burst. In Torna, I was hitting them every battle. But the best change Torna ever made to the Xenoblade 2 format was to scrap the worst part of the core gameplay. One of the more controversial aspects of Xenoblade 2 was its blade bonding system, a gacha mechanic where you spent items called core crystals to recruit random blades. As I said in my critique of the base game, blade bonding was designed to add an element of chance that would make each playthrough of Xenoblade 2 a slightly different experience. But in practice, the system ended up punishing casual players. Rather than trying to fix a broken system, Torna simply threw it out, and the results are fantastic. Where in Xenoblade 2 you often had to work quite hard to get the right elements, combo pieces, and party roles set up, in Torna your party is fixed, and all the pieces of the puzzle are designed to work together. And when you no longer have to grind for core crystals to be effective in combat, all you have to worry about is getting to know the characters you have. All of these changes come together in a really beautiful way. The flow of cancelling normal attacks into arts, into Vanguard Switch, back into arts, and finishing with a blade special feels truly amazing. Switch arts, blade switching, and dual sets of Vanguard and Rearguard arts for each character opens up more paths to finishing driver combos than ever before. And timing your Vanguard switches to keep your characters alive and your combos going is a lot of fun. Xenoblade 2 made figuring out how to enjoy combat a puzzle for you to solve. Torna is designed to ensure you're having fun right from the start. Easier chain attacks and low-effort full bursts make Torna a less challenging game, but they also make fighting feel like less of a chore. Enemies go down faster, combat is more fast-paced, and you can take on tougher monsters and groups of monsters more easily. Honestly, I had so much fun fighting in Torna, it almost felt wrong. And it's kind of a weird feeling when you realize just how much work some games make you do to actually enjoy them. That said, Torna's combat system isn't perfect. It's still a bit slow to get going before you unlock all the mechanics, some mandatory battles have a bit of sloppy design, and the tutorial fight that introduces chain attacks could have used a bit more playtesting. But these are really minor issues, and the overall experience is simply amazing. Vanguard Switch is one of the most cleverly designed game mechanics I've ever seen. but it's not just great for the game's battles. It's also incredibly effective at conveying the most important part of Xenoblade 2's world building. And ironically, it seems like it might have happened by mistake. Xenoblade 2's central theme is the power we draw from bonds of trust, and the game explores this idea through the special relationships between drivers and blades. But even a massive RPG like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 couldn't hope to fully explore such an interesting concept. Torna was a chance to continue the examination, and in many ways the expansion does an even better job than the base game. While Xenoblade 2 had scenes where blades acted independently of their drivers, like when Brigid appears in Torgoth without Morag, this dynamic was never reflected in the game's party management. In Torna, the capacity for blades to pick their own path is clearly shown. Jin fights solo beside Hugo's and Adam's teams, while Laura and Hayes stay behind in Gormat. Brigid heads up another solo team, while Hugo and Aegeon are away. And Minath is Amalthus's blade by birth, but he's Adam's partner by choice. And the idea of a blade gaining trust with a driver he's not bonded to is just super interesting. The game does a lot to explore the involuntary nature of the driver-blade bond. Just like with family, any relationship you're forced into is going to be a complex one. The chain of side quests that tells the story of the clueless newbie driver Lita and her frustrated blade Kaeda really drives home the point that some of the best relationships in life are the ones you grow into. And while you can never choose your family, you can still make the best of the one you got. Torna also touches some natural consequences of the driver-blade bond that were kind of ignored in Xenoblade 2, like the idea of jealousy between blades that share the same driver. We also see some of the cultural impact of the driver-blade bond, and the effects it can have on people's lives. Hugo became Emperor of Morardain only because his older brother couldn't become a driver and claim Aegeon and Brigid, and Adam's uncle Zetar was first in line to be Mithra's driver, but failed to resonate with her core crystal. And while Zetar is a spiteful jerk for taking it out on his nephew, I really can't blame him for being resentful. But Torna doesn't just expand on the ideas from the base game. It also fixes some of the issues I had with its world building. Because Xenoblade 2 suffers from a bit of a contradiction between theory and practice. What the game tells us about how the world works doesn't always vibe with the way the game plays. Torna's combat system was designed to provide a different experience without straying too far from the base game. And Tetsuya Takahashi, creator of the Xenoblade series, has said that one of the guiding principles behind this design was to represent the gulf of time that separates the story of Torna from Xenoblade 2, and show that 500 years ago, drivers and blades had not yet achieved the kind of coordination you see in the base game. So instead of working together as a single unit, like in Xenoblade 2, Torna's combat system has you switching back and forth between driver and blade. But in my opinion, it's really Torna that does the better job of conveying the intimate bond between drivers and blades. In Xenoblade 2, blades are treated like tools, to be engaged or disengaged as the situation demands, swapped to other drivers if they're not working out, or even released back into the wild if you run out of space or just don't want them. And if you stop for a moment to think about what it means to break the bond between a driver and blade, that's actually pretty messed up. In Torna, a driver and blade unit is called a team. Drivers and blades now both have their own arts, instead of the driver assuming the blade's weapon and techniques. And drivers and blades now take part in chain attacks on equal terms. The emphasis on fixed driver-blade formations over a blade bonding system helps drive home the point that these are relationships that last for life. And what could more perfectly illustrate the bond of trust and loyalty that exists between a driver and blade than the Vanguard switch mechanic, where the two take turns supporting each other while standing ready to leap into the fray to shield their companion with their own body. Torna's combat system describes a true partnership between equals, while the base game portrays blades as weapons in the hands of drivers, which ironically is exactly what Jin was saying all along.
A man once said, "Live together with the humans." Really? We were just living for the humans.
In old Torna, humans and blades lived in harmony, and it was only after Amalthus broke the world that everything started going wrong. But not all of the game's design choices are equally fortunate. Torna wants to be both a standalone story and a prequel to Xenoblade 2, and honestly, it doesn't do a great job of either. The story of Torna gets off to a really good start. The game sets the stage with a great narration, slides into an awesome cutscene that shows the protagonists Jin and Laura kicking some serious butt, and then leads right into the thick of things with your first tutorial battle. 2 minutes in and we've already been introduced to the heroes, had a basic primer on the overall conflict, and gotten a feel for combat. All games should start this strong. But it doesn't take long for Torna's problems to start to show. Rather than a deliberately crafted narrative, Torna's story reads like someone took all the flashbacks and references from Xenoblade 2 and then worked backwards to try to fit everything mentioned into a single story. Jin and Laura, Adam and Mithra, Amalthus' rise to power, and the Aegis War. The game tries to tell a bunch of different stories at the same time, and the result is that none of them get the focus they deserve. A lot of the story has a kind of random feel. The whole trip to Gormat to find out what happened to Laura's mother is a meaningless diversion from the central conflict. There's really no reason for Adam to accompany Laura on a personal fact-finding mission, when he has a nation to defend against a dire threat. The entire trip is just an excuse to show a familiar part of the base game's world, and put the heroes in contact with Hugo. But that could have honestly happened anywhere. And even the character of Hugo feels shoehorned into the story. The Emperor of Mor Ardain doesn't add much of anything to the overall narrative, and he could easily be removed from the game without impacting the story. Torna's central conflict is the war against Malice, who's trying to plunge the world into chaos. But only a small part of the main story directly deals with Malice's threat. The heroes spend most of the game preparing for Malice's arrival, but they never take any proactive steps against the antagonist. The only reason the plot even works is because Malice lets the heroes take their time. He spends most of the game idling away while the heroes run errands. And because the story spins its wheels with filler content, even Malice, the primary antagonist, gets so little screen time. He feels like an extra in his own story. Torna also does a lot of stuff that only makes sense in the context of a prequel. The game puts this weirdly strong emphasis on Adam's uncle Zetar, but in the end he's completely inconsequential to the whole story. He's basically an Easter egg for the people who really paid attention to the base game's lore, but his presence in the story feels way too significant for someone who does nothing. Another example is Stanif, the creepy scientist guy whose name is never given in the actual game. Torna has this whole subplot about Amalthus' experiments with Blade Eater technology, but the only impact it has on the story is to transform the villain Gort into a horrible monster. Stanif is there to illustrate Amalthus' rise to power, but since he's not properly integrated into the main plot, it's just a lot of wasted space to make a minor point. But the most glaring issue with Torna's story, whether you see it from the perspective of a standalone title or as a prequel, is the game's utterly baffling ending. Not the final battle against Malice, which serves as the game's climax, but the stuff that comes afterwards. Torna tries really hard to make this throwaway character from Laura's past into a major villain, but the showdown with Gort comes out of nowhere, and he doesn't even matter to the game's story. He doesn't even matter to Laura. Gort could have made a decent subvillain if the game had started with Laura on a quest to hunt him down after he killed her mother. Laura could have been drawn into Adam's war against Malice and made a difficult choice to abandon her vengeance in order to help protect the people of Torna. This could have been a meaningful way to cap off Laura's character arc, showing that she's risen above her miserable childhood to become a true knight. And if Laura had later died at Gort's hands during Amalthus' invasion of Torna, it could have shown Jin, in a twisted way, that Laura was wrong to give up her vengeance. That protecting the innocent is meaningless as long as the world is fundamentally evil. The perfect catalyst to send Jin down the dark path of vengeance upon which we find him in the base game. But that's not what Torna's all about. Laura doesn't get a character arc, because the game needs her to be a perfect person. Because Torna isn't about the Laura who lived, it's about the Laura Jin lost. Which brings us to the matter of Torna's most important scene. The one we never get. As a prequel, Torna gets a lot for free. But for a game that was sold on the promise of answering the questions Xenoblade 2 left to the imagination, the story doesn't do a very good job of keeping that promise. In its best moments, Torna does a fantastic job of enriching the story of Xenoblade 2 by providing insight into characters and events from the base game. Getting to know Laura makes Jin a better character. Mithra's interactions with Malus in Xenoblade 2 take on whole new meanings when you contrast them with the ones from Torna. And familiar scenes like Laura's sparring session with Adam are super fun to see when they're put in their proper context. The added context also helps reframe some of the base game's most significant moments. The scene where Jin murders Fan Lenorn at Temperantia takes on a much deeper meaning when you know Hayes' story. By showing us the past, Torna turns Jin's brutal slaying into an act of compassion and makes Fan's death hit even harder. But even though Torna expands on many of the events from the base game, it doesn't do a lot to answer the questions that truly matter. It doesn't explain how Amalthus reached the World Tree or why he gave Mithra's core crystal to the kingdom of Torna. It doesn't show the war with Indol or how Torna was actually destroyed, leaving me more confused about these events than before I played the game. And because of how Torna is framed, the story starts after the most important relationships have already formed and ends before the most interesting questions are answered. We don't get to see Mithra's first awakening from her core crystal, or how the dynamic between her and Adam developed over time. We don't get any new insights into Malus, or the exact nature of his relationship with Amalthus. And the story is over long before Jin and Malus strike up their strange partnership, which would have been such an amazing story to tell. And all of this comes back to a lack of focus. Torna tries to tell too many stories at once, and fails to do justice to any of them. But all of these broken promises could have been excused if the game had kept the most important one. And it all comes down to a single scene, the critical moment Torna had to get right. A lot of Torna's draw comes from the promise of seeing Jin's past, and getting some actual answers as to why Xenoblade 2's most enigmatic antagonist broke bad. And even though the base game gave us more or less the answer, there's still a lot of ground to cover between losing Laura and wanting to break the world. Torna does a great job of showing the depth of Laura and Jin's relationship. But to really sell Jin's transformation, the game needed to nail the moment he lost her. We should have lived this moment with Jin, held his sword as he tried to save her, and been there beside her as she lay dying. But Laura's death, Torna's most important scene, the one it should have spent the whole story building towards for an emotional climax, isn't even a part of the game. Instead of making us play through that scene and letting us experience Jin's grief firsthand, the game simply ends before we get there. It's abrupt, awkward, and honestly baffling. It's been a long time since I felt so cheated by a game's story. Torna made me love Laura and understand what she meant for Jin. But what Torna failed to do was to give a truly convincing argument for Jin's transformation. If anything, having seen what a saint Laura was, it's even harder for me to reconcile the noble swordsman from Torna with the nihilistic villain from Xenoblade 2. And while Jin clearly lost a large part of himself when he became a flesh eater, and centuries of suffering and bloodshed must have taken their toll on his soul, it feels just a little too much like cheating to simply say he lost his mind. The transformation from Laura's blade to Malus's partner in crime is a fascinating story, but even after Torna, it remains untold. I can imagine it, but I honestly really wanted to see it, and I'd expected to do so in this game. Torna's story lacks in focus and intention. where it should have been exploring the central relationships that form the heart and soul of the game's conflict. Instead, it spins its wheels with filler content. But the worst problem with Torna's story is the way it's built into the gameplay. Xenoblade 2 made the unfortunate design choice of using field skills as a gating mechanic for the main story. Basically, if you tried to rush through the game, mandatory field skill checks would stop you dead in your tracks at several points, forcing you to engage with Xenoblade 2's side content in order to progress. The developers wanted people to fall in love with their big open world and complex party customization, but the way it was handled ended up frustrating a lot of casual players. Torna dropped this design feature, but kept the philosophy. Only this time, the intent is slightly different. One of the game's major new mechanics is the community system, where you talk to NPCs and complete side quests to increase your standing in the community, which in turn unlocks new quests. This would have been totally fine, if not for one thing. Much like the base game used field skills to force players to engage with its side content, Torna uses its community system to pad the main story. At 2 points in the game, you're asked to raise your community level before you can proceed with the story. This means hours of grinding mandatory side quests before you're allowed to move on. And the game couldn't even find a good excuse to weave these tasks into the story. It all starts when you reach the royal capital of Auresco in the kingdom of Torna. Instead of going after Malus or preparing for his arrival, you're told to learn about the woes of the people. This plot point is so ridiculous, they even have Mithra hang a lampshade on it. But hanging a lampshade on a dumb plot point doesn't make it any less dumb. And the fact that it's Mithra, the immature and impetuous one, who has to be the voice of reason here, frames it as the wrong thing to say. And the story does the same thing again before the final battle, while Malus is literally waiting for you at the Titan's core, ready to destroy it. The way community is used to gate your progress takes all the tension and urgency out of the story. The best side quests deal with preparing evacuation ships and building shelters for the people of Auresco. But many of the tasks focus on the personal lives and ambitions of individual NPCs. This would be fine if the quests were optional, and you can pretend it's happening outside of the main story. But when you realize that it's actually canon that the heroes of Torna spent time helping a Nopon merchant design cute hats instead of dealing with Malus, the suspension of disbelief just shatters hard. The thing is, Torna's story is super short, and if it wasn't for community, you could probably clear it in less than 10 hours. And when you view the community system as something separate from the main story, it almost feels like they ran out of time to finish the story and crammed a bunch of optional content in there to pad out the playtime. But it all makes sense when you realize what's actually going on. Community isn't a diversion from the main story. It is the main story. The community system is there to make you interact with the people of Torna and get you invested in their well-being. The devs wanted you to know the people of Torna, not just as faceless NPCs, but as individual characters, so that you'd actually care when tragedy strikes at the end of the game. But forcing players to engage with the game's side content is a design choice that can really backfire. Optional content is one of the best things about JRPGs, but when it's made mandatory, it can feel like a chore. Some players won't even notice because they're doing everything anyway, but others will see it as a forced interlude between parts of the main story and end up hating it. A lot of game design comes down to the way things are framed, and I would have enjoyed this content a lot more if I'd been allowed to engage with it at my own pace. If the devs wanted me to care about the people of Torna, forcing me to do their busy work wasn't the way to do it. The game's story should have been built around helping the people of Torna prepare for the coming calamity, and the most important side quests should have been reworked as parts of the main story. Preparing the city's defenses, defeating roaming artifices, and evacuating refugees. Quests that directly address the threat of Malus and give a sense of urgency to the hero's tasks. And the rest of this stuff should have actually been optional. But Torna's community system has a saving grace: the conversations that surround them. because even though Torna is one of the most mediocre stories I've ever played, it has a redeeming feature. The one part of the story that's so good, it turns a hot mess of a tale into a wonderful experience. Before I go on, I just want to say if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. And if you want to support me, consider subscribing to my channel, so I know people want to see more videos like this. Torna the Golden Country has probably the best cast of characters in the Xenoblade franchise, and the story puts this on display as often as it can. Cutscenes are full of engaging dialogue and meaningful interactions, like the conversation between Adam and Mithra after meeting Amalthus in Indol. Sequences like the cooking session where Milton explains why Mithra should never be allowed near a kitchen are super fun and charming, and the game's optional campsite chats, which replace Xenoblade 2's heart-to-heart mechanic, give lots of great insight into Torna's heroes. But some of the game's most meaningful interactions actually come from its side quests. Some are fun and some are not, but they all serve as catalysts for some sort of character development. The side stories form a backdrop for the heroes to react to, giving you a chance to learn more about who they are. It's the best way I think I've ever seen this done, and scenes like Laura telling Jin and Hayes about her dream to build a home for orphans make even the most tedious fetch quest more than worth it. Torna really sells the feeling of being a tight-knit group of companions on an epic journey. And getting to know the heroes both as individuals and in how they relate to each other is absolutely captivating. The voice actors also do a fantastic job of bringing the characters to life, and the banter between them is seriously great. Mithra and Brigid taunting each other makes me want to write spicy fanfics, and Laura's cheerful praise for Jin is just unbearably cute.
That one blew me away. Dream team confirmed.
While Torna's cast of heroes is consistently great, it's really a tale of two couples. The game does a great job of humanizing Jin, showing a side of him that's a lot more sympathetic than the broken man from Xenoblade 2. But even more importantly, Torna crushes it when it comes to Laura. The game's protagonist is kind, encouraging, and unrelentingly enthusiastic. And I have to give a lot of credit to her voice actress, Anna Koval, for giving such a charming performance. By showing what a wonderful person Jin's driver was and the intimate relationship the two shared, Torna makes Jin's heartbreak seem perfectly natural. But as much as I love Jin and Laura, this should have really been the story of Adam and Mithra. And many of the issues with the game's narrative could have been solved if the spotlight had been on the Aegis. The Mithra of Torna is coarse, bratty, and impulsive, a diamond in the rough, who hides her fragile heart beneath a cold veneer of sarcastic wit and feigned indifference. She's a person with enormous room to grow, and the way that growth is portrayed is super engaging. Like Malice, Mithra is still a child, learning about the world. She just happens to have a better driver. Adam Origo may well be my favorite character in all of the Xenoblade series. After having seen the legend in Xenoblade 2, seeing the man behind the myth is quite the contrast. And Torna's Adam is such a fun guy. He's dramatic, cheerful, and a natural leader, but he also struggles with his royal birthright and the expectations placed upon him. Adam is full of doubts and uncertainties and fears losing control of Mithra's power, and that's a great inner conflict. The flawed bond between Adam and Mithra makes for a very compelling story. Their relationship is complex, nuanced, and believable, and it feels more like a pairing of equals than the mother-son vibe I got from Pyra and Rex. But it's this flaw that eventually leads to disaster. Adam's trust in Mithra wasn't strong enough to guide her, and his failure to support his blade ultimately led to the destruction of Auresco. Adam is a much more interesting character than Rex, but he wasn't the driver Mithra needed. Stories live and die by the strength of their characters. Torna's narrative may be weak in many ways, but the heroes more than make up for the flaws, and the overall experience is one that stayed with me. and there are some incredible highlights along the way, like the final battle with Malice and Mithra's heartbreaking reaction in the aftermath. The game tried to make me love the people of Torna, but it was the heroes who fought to save them who won my heart. And even though they couldn't save the country, at least they could save the story of Torna. This is a game that's designed to make you fall in love with a bunch of characters and then kill them off or drive them insane. And in that sense, the sense of actually making you feel something, this is a better story than most. But the story could have been a lot better. Because in my opinion, Torna shouldn't have been a standalone story in the first place. And to explain why, we have to talk about timing. Tetsuya Takahashi has said that the events of Torna were originally meant to be told in the base game, sitting somewhere between the 7th and 8th chapters of the main story. And while Torna can feel like an incomplete tale when it stands on its own legs, when you see it as setup for the final chapters of Xenoblade 2, this timing makes a lot of sense. But I would argue that there's an even better place to put this story. While the final 3 chapters have some very strong beats, by the end of chapter 7, we've already had the game's emotional climax. Numa's awakening at the Gotrok Oracle ruins and Pyra and Mithra's commitment to live. At this point in the story, Rex and Numa already have all they need to save the world. An unshakable bond of trust. Instead, I would start the story of Torna at the end of chapter 6. But I would do it in kind of a different way. In chapter 6, the heroes journey to the land of Tantal in search of the Omega Feather, an artifact they need to reach the World Tree. After a series of dramatic events, Jin and Malice confront the heroes at Genbu Crown. Here, Jin reveals the devastating power of his true form, and hands the heroes a humiliating defeat. With their lives on the line, Pyra threatens to annihilate herself if Jin won't spare the others. The chapter ends with Pyra captured, the Omega Feather stolen, and the hero's quest seemingly over. This is Xenoblade 2's darkest hour, which means it's also the perfect setup for the story of Torna. Because Torna is an argument in support of the base game's message. Before we see how trust can heal the world, we first must see how lack of trust can poison it. One of the main reasons why the story of Torna was cut out of the base game and delivered as DLC was because they couldn't find a natural way to fit such a large chunk of backstory into the main plot. And it is kind of hard to squeeze 10 hours of flashbacks into the middle of a story without disrupting the narrative. While we can only speculate on the kinds of adjustments they would have made to the story if they kept Torna in, there is a place in the base game where I feel this content would be a natural fit. After the disaster at Genbu Crown, the heroes regroup and learn about the true Sword of the Aegis, the symbol of Adam's failure and Rex's final hope to save Pyra. And their quest for answers about Adam's past leads them to Spirit Crucible Elpis. Instead of the tedious grind we got in the main game, I would make this dungeon into the vehicle that delivers the story of Torna. Spirit Crucible Elpis is the perfect place to weave in a bit of narrative magic, blending the hero's exploration of the dungeon with flashbacks of the events of Torna, framed as visions shown to the heroes by Adam's latent memories left behind in the thin ether of the Spirit Crucible. Rex and the others would live the story of Torna through their own eyes. But the story's final conclusion, the tragedy of Mithra, should be saved for the very end. The final test would remain a spiritual battle, but it would play out very differently. Rather than fighting a bunch of Adam's shadows, the climax of Spirit Crucible Elpis should be a battle against Adam and Mithra as driver and blade. And it's only here, at the very end, that we finally learn the truth of Mithra's horror. The battle with Malice and its awful aftermath would serve as the backdrop to this desperate fight, and throughout the confrontation, the twin shadows of Adam's regret and Mithra's pain would taunt the hero. It's pointless, they say. Blind trust is a foolish ideal, they claim. They poke and prod at Rex's convictions, laying bare his every doubt, until he stands on the brink of despair. If Adam, the legendary hero, could not awaken Mithra's potential, then what chance does Rex have? But Rex has someone who can show him the way. Nia's heartfelt declaration of love would serve as the catalyst for Rex's victory. Her devotion and affection, which Rex has earned throughout the story, show him what he must do to save Pyra. Armed with a template of what unconditional love looks like, he scatters the shadows of Adam and Mithra with the light of his conviction. He's ready to face his darkest fears, ready to heal Pyra's heart. So when he shows up at the cliffs of Mortha to save her, and she reveals that she's come all this way just to ask the architect to die, Rex could honestly tell her, "I know, but I won't let you." In the end, Torna the Golden Country is a game about making fashionable hats for egg-shaped furries, and these are just my personal opinions. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Torna the Golden Country in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.